All right, let's get this started. Hi everyone, I'm Raj Jambodkar. I work on product initiatives here at Bright Saver. We're really excited today to have the second webinar in our series. In this particular webinar, we're going to explore how recent legislative wins in Germany and Utah can serve as templates for state-by-state energy strategy in the United States to drive broader plug-in solar adoption. What's needed to overcome utility and political pushback, and how state-level champions can catalyze change even without federal incentives. Um, so without much further ado, I would love to introduce our panelists for today. First, we have Sachu Constantine. He's the executive director of Vote Solar, a national nonprofit working to make solar power more accessible, affordable, and equitable across the United States. He's a clean energy policy expert with over 2 decades of experience. He leads Vote Solar's mission to accelerate state-level solutions that expand distributed solar adoption, reduce energy burdens, and combat the climate crisis. We also have Dr. Philip Wight, who's an associate professor of history at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Dr. Wight is a clean energy policy expert and associate professor of history at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, where his work focuses on the intersection of energy systems, policy, and environmental justice in Arctic and rural communities. He has played a key role in shaping Alaska Clean Energy's future and also helping to build a broad bipartisan coalition to pass the state's first community solar legislation. And we have Cora Stryker, co-founder of Bright Saver. Bright Saver is a nonprofit organization dedicated to expanding access to clean energy through simple, affordable plug-in solar systems. Cora leads Bright Saver's policy and equity initiatives with a focus on coalition building, state-level policy reform, energy equity, and community resilience. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Cora, and I'll join you guys in a bit.
Welcome, everyone. I'm so happy to be here with my two colleagues, and I'm so happy to be here with everyone on the call. As you know, I work at Bright Saver, co-founding it, and my focus is plug-in solar, but we're going to be talking about solar generally and envisioning what our country could look like if we do what we're supposed to do, what we're trying to do. So I'm imagining this in two parts. The first part is, what does the future look like if we win, when we win? And the second part is, how do we get there? So Sachu, I'm going to start with you. You've said to me once, this is a couple months ago, if we win, we can double solar production in this country. And if we add balcony solar, plug-in solar, we can also double it. So I think about that all the time, to tell you the truth. It really grounds me in what we're fighting for. So I would love to hear from you. What does winning mean?
Well, thanks, Cora, and thanks for having me on. This is great. This is my favorite topic to talk about. And yes, I think we can double rooftop solar in this country. We can probably do much more than that with rooftop solar alone. Balcony solar is another easily added resource. We've seen Germany putting in more gigawatts of balcony solar in 1 year than we've put in of all types of rooftop solar, for example, just in the last few years. That curve is ramping up. Right now, we have somewhere north of 50 gigawatts of distributed solar on our grid. Most of that distributed solar looks like rooftop solar. We believe that by 2035, we can actually get to about 180, so more than 3x what we have, 3 times what we have right now, if we have the right policies and markets and opportunities in place, if we give people the choice that they want to make for a clean energy future, for their own energy agency. That's a number that we think we could reach pretty quickly. And that's important given the larger context of climate and the ailing grid. And then if you think about balcony solar, this idea of plug-in solar, of really stripping away all of the interconnection delays and the purchasing and financing delays that sometimes plague the rooftop solar industry. Well, now you have a whole nother aspect of solar that we can add, and it's bringing in renters and people in places where you can't necessarily put a rooftop array out there, or you don't have a local community solar access. So I think the potential is fantastic, and we talk about what that would look like, a world where we have doubled, tripled, quadrupled the amount of local solar on the grid. And there's a couple things that we know. One is that means that our communities are safer, they're more resilient, the energy is more affordable for them. The grid itself is protected from some of the intense effects of climate change, of load growth, and affordability. But I think the other thing that's great about that and that potential is just how fast we can do it. We can do that very quickly. We've seen it in Germany, we've seen it in Australia, we've seen it in Japan. We're starting to see it in the UK, and we've seen fits and starts of that here in this country. So I think the potential is fantastic. And imagine just walking around your town, your city, your community, and there's solar arrays on the schools and on the buildings, and that all of those solar arrays and the batteries in the garages and the electric vehicles parked on the street are all working together to make sure that the lights stay on, that those are affordable, and quite frankly, they're going to have a pretty profound impact on the air quality of life, and other aspects, including jobs for that matter, right? I mean, it's this amazing mass of benefits from pursuing this goal.
I love it. Thank you. And I want to follow up on that because, my parents live in Palo Alto. I did not grow up there. But I go to their house and I see literally this line. I don't think there's any house on their street that does not have an EV plugged in at the end of the day. And many have solar panels, not all. And I always think like, oh, this is the future. And I would love to throw it to both of you. How do we ensure that the future that we're talking about does not just happen in the Palo Altos of the world? How do we ensure that that is something that we see in cities, in rural communities? What do you guys think? Phil, maybe I'll throw that to you, since you work in Alaska and you see the gamut.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thank you, Cora, and pleasure to be here talking about this. Alaska is certainly a place where, regardless of our a perception of Alaska as this energy state, we have real energy challenges. We have real energy poverty up here. And so when I think about how do we democratize these solutions, how do we bring it to each and every Alaskan, each and every American, I think it goes back to something that you said at the outset here, which is really about we need to simplify the solutions and we need to scale them up. Right. And so that's why I'm, I think, as I've told you before, unreasonably excited about the idea of balcony solar. And when I found out about it, I quickly went out and got an inverter and a system, and I've been producing balcony solar now for a couple months. And while at the same time, I've been struggling to expand my existing net meter solar installation because it's so technically complicated. Right, to work with the utility, to work with the electrician, not to mention to line up the capital and the financing. And so I think about a world in which we're not only seeing this doubling of behind the meter solar as we've talked about, but we're also thinking about how do we create a world of cheap electrification. Right. So this isn't just about, obviously, this is about the clean part of the equation, but we need to not only produce these clean electrons, we need to use them to electrify everything, as we all know. And so what I'm excited about is not just balcony solar, but we can think about this broader range of technologies. On the last webinar, we heard about how the next frontier in Germany is plug-in batteries as part of these systems, right? And then we've also heard really exciting news about, 120 volt induction stoves and 120 volt water heaters. And so we can think about, this whole suite of consumer technologies, which are easy for people to use. They're cheaper products. They're more accessible. And I don't know what you want to call it. You could call it a three-prong revolution, if you will, right? With that, you don't need a professional electrician. You don't need 240 volts. We're giving the power back to the people. And at the end of the day, I think this is fundamentally about these are better products, and clean electrification makes people's lives better. And when you give them that access, they're going to choose it, and we're going to win. And I think one thing that we need to remind ourselves of in this dark moment following the passage of the reconciliation bill is that, this is already a dominant industry. right? This is an industry that, if you look over the past couple of years, clean energy, we are adding something like 90% of the capacity to the grid between solar, storage, and wind. And so we just need to continue that that trajectory, that track record of being a dominant industry that is providing solutions that people want.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Well, let me
Cora,
challenge. Oh, go ahead, Seth.
Could I add something to that? Because
Yeah,
I
please.
think Philip is speaking to something that's really important. Look, our current grid, the current energy system that we have, is simply not built for these kinds of challenges. The massive load growth that's going to happen because of electrification, all the technologies that Phil was speaking to, right? Those are here, those are real. They're coming into people's homes. I might soften that we don't need electricians. My friends in IBEW, I think they have a space in this. The jobs on the ground for people installing all this equipment are a big aspect of this as well. But just thinking about the grid and electrification and load growth that's associated with electrification and the affordability question that we have to make this transition, it does suggest that solar, batteries, clean energy in general will win. I think the big question here is at what speed and what scale, and how much is it going to cost us? How much are people going to be able to participate in this system? And that's, Vote Solar pursues this people-centered, solutions-oriented vision, and we do talk about the complexities of interconnection and permitting and all of that. And here comes balcony solar as a potential to solve some of that for a big section of the market. But taken as a whole, we're going to win. The question is, can we win in time?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah, I think about that every day. Thank you for framing it that way. And I think, we've all spent some time in the climate activism world. And I think about this frequently. One of my colleagues said, and I didn't hear it just once, we'll let the market take care of it. We don't have to work on that. The market will take care of it. And I think that's a really important thing to dissect and think about, because as you say, if we're passive, if we let it happen at its own pace, it might not happen fast enough. This took 10 years to ramp up in Germany. Balcony Solar did. I don't feel we have 10 years. I know you all don't feel we have 10 years. So I think that one thing I think about a lot is how can we, as activists, as people who care about climate and equity, what can we do to speed this along, to enable the market? And I'd love to hear from you two as to what you think we can do. And then I'll back up a little bit and talk about these two playbooks we have, what happened in Germany, what is happening in Utah.
Yeah, well, maybe I can just jump in because I'm sure
Yeah.
Sach has a lot to say here. As a historian, I would say this, what is the market, right? When we say that, we really need to unpack that. And of course, there's no such thing as a free market. And the market exists because government is there to enforce contracts, right? So as we're thinking about this moment in time, I think it's actually really useful to go back to the origins of the electric utility industry, right? And I think we need to be as creative today as we were in the 1880s and 1890s when we were thinking about this new remarkable technology and what it could do for people, right? And we created these regulatory constructs that created things like the monopoly utility industry, and we created, public utility commissions, right? And this is a moment in time when we think about the challenges in front of us: extraordinary load growth, climate disruption, geopolitical instability. The technologies that we're talking about here can be game-changing for individual homeowners, for communities. And so I think it's really important for us to think about what are the barriers that we have erected deliberately, or sometimes these happen, we're trying to do the right thing and there's unintended consequences. What are the barriers that have been erected over the past 50 years, 100 years, and what purposes are those really serving, right? And at the end of the day, how do we reduce or eliminate some of those barriers in order to bring these benefits to the people? Because at the end of the day, people want the benefits from these products that we're talking about, right? People want cleaner electricity. They want cheaper electricity. They want a better quality of life. And so, you know, whether that's doing what New Jersey is doing in automating permitting, right? I'm really excited about that. Whether that is doing what Utah did, right? If you think about the brilliance of the Utah legislation and balcony solar in general as enabling legislation, right? We might be talking about 2 sentences, right? Or 5 words that basically just make it so that consumers can install balcony solar like any other appliance, right? I think it's ridiculous that we have these laws on the book that prevent individuals from plugging things into their own homes that save them money, right? On some theoretical level, this is no different than an energy efficient appliance, right? And so I think we need to really go back to those fundamentals and think about, of course, I'm going to say we should think about the history of how we got here. But I think we need to know how we got here in order to think about in the next 10 years, how do we really unlock the value for Americans and people, for that matter, all throughout the world who can embrace this set of solutions.
Well, Phil, as a historian, I'd love to hear a quick debrief. How did we get here?
Well, I mean, it's there is a lot to say there. Well, I would just focus on, I think there have been many well-intentioned policies that have actually served us well in the past, whether that is the regulated monopoly utility, and I'm not arguing that we should necessarily throw out that model or anything like that, or whether it has to do with the history of net metering, right? How that came about and so many of the net metering battles that we've been having. But as we're talking about some of these technology solutions, right? I'm a firm defender of net metering. We have it here in Alaska. It has enabled it so that Alaskans, between our 2 major cities here, Fairbanks and Anchorage, we've actually installed more distributed solar and more renewables than our utilities have over the past 12 years, right? If you give people the solutions they're looking for, they will scale it up. So I'm a big fan of net metering, but we all know about how complicated the net metering battles have become. And if we think about solutions like balcony solar, it offers another avenue to give people the ability to install this technology. So those are just a couple things that I throw out there, but I think we have to have a whole separate class on how
Yeah, there's some of my staff go to something called rate school, where it's a crash course in how regulatory policy works across the country and over time. And it is really important to know that you can't know your future if you don't know your past, right? And I think that's important here, as it is in any political or social context. The idea of a regulated monopoly certainly made sense 150 years ago, and it still continues to make sense in certain areas. That monopoly has shrunk. The natural monopoly that we are trying to create a sense of competition, a pressure to keep prices down, an expectation of good service. We created that in this big regulated monopoly space because that was what we had in front of us. Well, now when we look at solar and its form factors, it can be on a traffic light, it can be on a home, it can be on a balcony, it can be in a massive plant, it can be on a Walmart. Right? We have this massive flexibility. We have more agency, more opportunity for participation. That means the monopoly has shrunk. And so our regulations and our policies have to adapt to that. And one of the things that we see in this patchwork of policies and applications across the state is that there are places where it's working. We know, Philip pointed it out, net metering was a really simple, elegant step forward. Now, it gets complicated when we start to talk about what's the cost and the value. But the key thing to focus on here is the aggregation of value that we can put on solar. So yes, it's going to help me as an individual with my bills and with my individual resilience and reliability. I can keep my lights on because I have a battery and a solar system here, and I'm managing what is becoming a pretty unmanageable electric bill over time. But it also, to Phil's point, it has value to this grid. This grid needs a ton of services. It needs voltage regulation, it needs frequency regulation, it needs ramp to meet peak demands during the day. It needs to be able to ramp down. All of these services have a value. So we don't have to put it all into the net metering proposition. There should be a simple, fair, easy proposition for customers to get value. But there also has to be accountability on the utility. These regulated utilities have to use the assets that these customers want to put out there. They have to use the batteries. They have to use the solar to help drive costs down, spread load out, reduce the most expensive hours, provide these grid, what we call ancillary services, right? The other things that the grid needs to run with things like virtual power plants. That's one of the great new innovations here. And I think that's something that's going to help us move forward. We've got to get regulators to wrap their heads around the idea of virtual power plants. To Phil's point, customers want solar. It's a viral product, right? When you look at a map of a heat map of how solar expands across the country, you see maybe a program starts some incentives here in this neighborhood. Well, then all of a sudden, those neighbors all get it. Cora, to your point about Palo Alto, right? Once one person on a block gets solar, pretty soon more people on that block get solar. There's a real latent demand. So we know that we can get investment from the public. We can get space to put all this solar, whether it's balconies or rooftops or schools or community gardens or large plants for that matter. But we have to hold those utilities accountable to then use it to help drive costs down, drive reliability up, and clean the system. Move these outdated combustion technologies off of the grid as soon as possible.
Yeah, Sachi, you hit on something that I think about frequently, which is how do we tell this story? And this sort of leads to Utah and our hero, Raymond Ward, who is a Republican legislator at the state level in Utah, who really took it upon himself. He read an article about balcony solar in Germany, and he asked what a lot of us asked, hey, why isn't this here? And he started going more deeply into it. We actually played a role in advising him. We were proud to do that. And he did this thing that in this political climate strikes me as miraculous. He built a coalition. He brought Democrats and Republicans together to pass this thing unanimously, HB 340, which essentially enables plug-in solar. And we can get into the weeds about what it does, but I want to stay a little high level and talk about how and why he was able to build that coalition. And this goes back to something you said, Sach, and your work, Phil. To me, I would argue part of why he was able to build this unanimous coalition is because plug-in balcony solar appeals to so many of our values across the political spectrum. We've got energy independence, energy resilience, climate, of course, energy affordability. I talked to someone a couple weeks ago who was interested in this to keep her mother's medication cold when the power went out. And Phil, I'm going to turn to you now because you played a key role in building a coalition in Alaska of some pretty strange bedfellows to pass community solar legislation last year. And I'd love it if you could speak a little bit to your experience in Alaska. How did you build this coalition? How did you bridge some gaps? Were there different stories, different narratives you used for these different stakeholders? I'd love to learn from how you did this.
Sure. Well, thanks for the question, Cora. And I should say that, my day job is at the University of Alaska as an energy historian. I also work part-time for the Alaska Public Interest Research Group, and it was through ACPIRG and a coalition of other consumer and environmental nonprofits that we worked on Alaska's first community solar legislation. And it was a really exciting experience. I'll say a few things about the Alaska context because it is different than the United States in some key regards, but I think there's a lot of lessons here which can be universalized. So one thing to say is that we have really high electricity bills up here, right? I know saying that to Californians, I don't want to trigger you guys, but relative to the rest of the country, up here in Fairbanks, I'm almost paying 30 cents per kilowatt hour, right? That is, almost double the national average. So people are looking to save money. And at the end of the day, Alaskans are remarkably pragmatic. right? Alaskans have always adopted the tools and the technologies that have enabled them to live better lives in a harsh climate, and often harsh climate. And so solar is one of these technologies, right? I have friends whose parents have worked for the oil companies for decades, but they've got solar on their off-grid cabin. Why? Because it works, and it's way easier than lugging in a generator and 20 gallons of diesel off-grid. Right. So I think when, solar here is embraced on a bipartisan basis, people are embracing these technologies that work. I think we're also really fortunate that the majority of Alaskans identify politically as independent or nonpartisan. So even though, we are a red state, we are filled with people who I think would like to see themselves as independently minded. And that reflects on our politics, right? So right now, we have the only state legislature, both in the House and the Senate, that have bipartisan majorities. Right? This is like almost unbelievable in our current polarized world. So what I'd say is in terms of building this coalition, right? We went into this, and I will say, one of the key enablers of this was thinking about a coalition of a broad diversity of folks, right? This really began from a number of nonprofits, but we knew from the very beginning, right? This is a solution that many independents and Republicans are also thinking about. And at the end of the day, for us, this was fundamentally about equity, right? It was fundamentally unfair that Alaskans who owned their own homes could go out and invest in net metered solar and get these phenomenal benefits from it. And yet, if you were a renter, if you had a shaded house, you were locked out of this energy solution, right? And everybody understands that fundamental energy inequality. And I think this also applies to balcony solar, right? There's an important lesson here. Another one of the important lessons that I think that we can draw moving forward is that there is an asymmetry between Democrats and Republicans when it comes to this legislation. And what I mean by that is, if you have a Democrat propose some of these solutions, often there will be significant resistance from the right side of the aisle. But if you have a Republican who puts forward these solutions, more often than not, Democrats will say, hey, that's a great idea, we're going to sign on to it, especially when it comes to solar and clean energy, right? And so this is one of the dynamics that happened in Alaska. And I would say we were remarkably lucky. We had the opportunity to work with some real visionaries and champions who wanted to move this forward, but the legislation got introduced and we were able to pass it within 2 years. And the other major thing that I'll say that's a little different in Alaska, but again, there's similarities here for parts of the United States. Here on the rail belt between Alaska and Anchorage, our biggest grid, 75% of the people live here. It's where most of the carbon emissions are. It is dominated by 4 rural electric co-ops, right? So we do not have investor-owned utilities. And as much as there was some resistance on the part of the utilities, at the end of the day, co-ops are governed by a democratically elected board of directors. And many of those directors were on board with this because they were hearing from their constituents that they wanted it. So that, fundamental basis of energy democracy, it's not that co-ops are always democratic, but they do have that kernel. That really helped us move the legislation forward because we were negotiating from day one with utilities, and utilities wanted to make this happen because of a variety of reasons, one of which were those democratically elected board of directors.
Yeah, I mean, Cora, what Phil is saying there goes back to this accountability argument. When we see accountability, when the people making decisions are accountable to their constituents, to their customers, if that's the case, you're going to see progress on solar because solar is popular. It's a nonpartisan issue when it comes down to it. It appeals, as you said, to so many of our shared values, but even to some of our individual and distinct values that might not be as common across all groups in society. But look, it's a libertarian issue. If you want government to keep its hands off your energy choices, hey, solar is for you. If you're more of a community-minded person, community solar and rooftop solar and shared solar are all appealing to you. If you're a climate activist, it appeals to you for that reason. there are just so many value propositions that we can stack that it's very hard to argue that it couldn't have popularity across the population. And if we know that, and if we activate that, and we hold the decision makers accountable to that, that's how we make progress. So coalition building is really important. What Phil was describing, the kind of patient, long-term, ground-up coalition building is really important to this, as well as the kind of top-down, here's the model policy, right? Here's the government analysis. We see tools that help us, tools like NREL's solar app. You were talking about automatic permitting and things like that. The solar app is a big step forward in that for states. We have seen streamlined processes, the Utah legislation that you spoke to, but across the board, you can find coalitions, whether you're in North Carolina. Governor Stein in North Carolina vetoed a really egregious bill. Now, the legislature has overridden his veto, so that's a bit of a setback here. But, the point is there were allies in states like North Carolina. We have one of my colleagues, one of my team is working with rural communities in North Carolina, who you could imagine are generally pretty conservative in terms of their voting patterns, but they recognize the needs of their communities, the advantage that solar can provide them. And our job as policy professionals is to translate all of that to this policy space and convince decision makers that not only do your constituents want this, they clearly want it, but it also can help you address the problems that you face, keeping the lights on, keeping costs down, making sure that the grid is reliable and up to our 21st century standards, right? That modernization piece, that affordability piece, that load growth piece, these are the bread and butter of regulatory commissions. So connecting these is our job right now.
Absolutely. And, you and Vote Solar work hard on both the legislative picture and the regulatory picture. So I want to go back to Phil's impossible question. What are the barriers? What are the big buckets of barriers you see such in your work? And in particular, when it comes to balcony plug-in solar, what would you advise us to work on in building a coalition? This is to you both, actually. Building a coalition state by state to make this get from where it is now, which is where Germany was 7 years ago, if 5 years ish. How would you advise us to move forward? Which barriers would you address? How would you address them?
Well, I think one of the most important aspects, and Phil, you spoke to this, and Cora, I think you spoke to this too, in Utah, the very simple language that in this case an individual really picked up on and pushed forward as a champion, the fact that balcony solar doesn't have to go through the regulatory interconnection process. That is the absolute key to unlock balcony solar.
And could you expand on that a little bit? Because I think that that's something that's not immediately intuitive to folks who aren't deep into this like we are.
Well, first of all, there are legitimate reasons that we have these barriers to just connecting to the grid, right? There are safety issues, there's operational issues that have to be taken care of. So you need equipment that is UL tested, certified, is up to all the codes. You need to have it installed in a safe way. Generally, when you're talking about let's say a 5 kilowatt system on a rooftop, if a firefighter or an electrician or anybody has to engage with that system, they have to know that it works the way they think it works, that you can shut it off, that you can do all that you need to do to be safe, and that it's responding to signals from the grid. And so that's what interconnection is about. It's making sure that all of those pieces fit together, that all of those safety elements are in place. But there are times and places and appliances that don't necessarily need all of that. The safety is built into them. We know, for example, the way that a stove works and connects to the electrical grid, or a hot water heater, or your HVAC system. And when you get down to it, especially balcony solar is more like those appliances than it is like the small power plant that I might put on my roof. In both cases, we want to make sure that they're safe and they're UL tested and all of that. But the balcony solar is something that you should be able to just plug in and not go through a very long interconnection process. And we don't have time to get into it, but the interconnection process is a real thorn in our side. It's a splinter in our eye right now. There's delays for the big plants on interconnection because of the way that utilities and regulators do their interconnection studies, like what can we interconnect and where can we interconnect it. And there's also delays for these smaller systems on people's rooftops. It can take weeks, months sometimes to get your interconnection and your permitting all lined up. So avoiding that is one of the things that countries like Australia have done for all of their solar, because they've standardized so much. It makes it a simple consumer decision. And then the utility, once you're connecting your solar, the utility is now using it because they know how it operates. They're using it to meet their needs. And so both parties are happy. In this country, we have a very balkanized system. So there's lots of complicated permitting and interconnection processes. Each utility is different. And so simplifying that is not only our job at Vote Solar, but I think it's the key to making balcony solar a real consumer opportunity. I will say, just I think to something Phil said earlier about the history, one of the biggest barriers to accessing this simplified solar interconnection process and to tapping into popular demand for solar is something that we call regulatory capture. The regulators have been listening to and hearing from these monopoly utilities for decades now. And those monopoly utilities have a vested interest sometimes in maintaining older systems. And these barriers to entry, whether it's interconnection or permitting, are simply a reflection of their material interest in this system, right? It's a barrier to entry helps the existing competitors. It keeps other competitors out. So what we're talking about here is a fundamental economic conflict between this new disruptive technology that will ultimately be the dominant source of energy and the old line incumbent energy system, and the regulatory decisions and the legislative decisions that govern that. That's the battleground here. That's where we're fighting.
Yeah.
And if I can just add one thing, Cora, you know, so this sounds so simple, but in my personal experience, this has been profound. Just introducing people to this idea is so powerful, right? The average person doesn't understand how a solar system works, right? They don't understand that the inverter puts out at 240 and how it connects and the disconnect and all this stuff that we're talking about, right? But if you tell the average person, look, you can have a solar panel on your deck, and then you have a simple inverter and you plug it into a socket and you basically need to do nothing else, right? And it will offset the energy that you're using, right? We're not talking about net metering. We're not talking about flowing back to the grid, right? That idea, you know, as I've shared it to Alaskans or other folks, their eyes just light up and they're almost dumbfounded. They're like, wait, it's that simple? And it can deliver the benefits that easily. And obviously, we know when it comes to implementing this and making sure that the technology is safe and it's UL listed, and as we're democratizing this, right, we do need to get into those details. But just beginning by, you know, seeding that idea with people and letting them know that, you know, at the end of the day, we have the tools, right? We have the technology, and it really does come down to reducing these, I don't want to call them artificial, but these historic barriers that have been in place that Sachu has been talking about. And the other thing that I would say with this is, and remind folks, is we don't have a choice in doing this, right? And it's not just that we don't have a choice from an environmental or climate reason. We also don't have a choice from an economic perspective, right? I think many of us are aware, right? There is a crisis of affordability happening with energy in this country right now. When we have a situation where something like 1/6 of Americans are behind on their electricity bills, right? That should be a 5-alarm fire. And at a moment when we have this load growth and you basically need energy from wherever you can get it, I mean, this is a no-brainer, and this, you know, can make such a big difference for people's bills that I would just really highlight those 2 points, right? We need to seed this idea as widely as possible, and we need to remind people that we do not have a choice at this moment that we're living in right now.
Yeah, and Cora, I think Phil said it perfectly. This is a no regrets policy. It's not going to solve all the problems, so we shouldn't be starry-eyed, right? Neither rooftop solar nor balcony solar nor the two combined are going to solve all the problems, but they are no regrets. There's literally only good to be had from allowing those two sources to flourish.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. I mean, y'all are saying so many of the things that I've been thinking, and I want to move a little bit to something that happened to me a few weeks ago. I was talking to a reporter, and I was describing what we're doing, and she said, "So you're really interested in putting more clean energy on the grid. That's your real focus." And I had this immediate response that no, that's not the only thing we're doing. So I would love to throw it to you two. In fighting for this vision, what else do you see yourself, do you see ourselves as a movement fighting for in addition to getting more clean energy on the grid?
Well, I mean, Phil said it, affordability. There's a crisis here. It's a kitchen table crisis. People need to manage their energy bills. Electricity is a basic price of entry into modern society. Nothing anymore that we run, as much as we might idealize a pristine rural existence, we run on electricity. Our cars are going to run on electricity, the lights, the cooking, the heating, the cooling, all of that. So affordability is absolutely essential at this point going forward. And we have to stress that over and over again. I think there's a little piece to that I want to add into the conversation here. I think it's important. And that is the affordability of the solar itself. Solar is cheap, and balcony solar is a low cost entry point for many people. But in this country, because of the complex policy environment and because we lack this stack of values, we are often found to be selling finance, not solar. What people get confused about, what turns them away as consumers, as individuals trying to engage here, is these complicated PPAs or financing arrangements, right? The super complex terms of a solar loan over multiple years. This should be a very simple transaction. This should be a very simple, can I afford it? Is there some amount of capital that I can tap into to get this system on my roof and then start to enjoy the benefits? So there is some pressure here on the solar industry and those of us in this space to meet the moment with more simplified, more trusted, more transparent transactions. So I just want to just add that as a note. I think that the big onus is, of course, on decision makers, and the value that we see in empowering a community, in giving them agency. It should appeal across the board to economic regulators, to social investors, to individual cities and communities, right? The idea of giving people more choice and more information and more transparency should always be something that we pursue. And I think it's on us to really do that here as well.
Well, thank you for that. And, I'm thinking about the folks on the call, the webinar, whose eyes are lighting up, like you talked about, Phil. What can folks do? Let's say there's someone on this call who thinks, yes, this is what we need right now. This is how we meet the moment. What can folks do right now, even if they are not going to adopt balcony solar, rooftop solar themselves, to advance this vision we have? Of the country we want to be living in? To both of you.
I'll throw out a few things there, and to Sachu's last point, I think one of the guiding ideas here is just fundamentally about consumer choice and consumer freedom, right? It's a basic thing. It also helps that I work for a consumer advocacy organization, so we think in terms of these values. But when it comes to what can the average person do, right? I would say a few different things, and correct me here, Cora, if you think I'm wrong, because you're more in the regulatory weeds on balcony solar than I am. But my understanding is there are not necessarily policies all throughout the country that prohibit this, right? There's some places where people have the green light to do this today. But I think even more than just installing the technology itself, sharing this idea, sharing this possibility, right? As Sach said at the outset, right? We have gigawatts of potential that are in front of us, right? That can make a real difference in people's lives. And we're not talking about some type of pie in the sky technology. We're not talking about fusion, right? We are talking about something so tangible, right? And that's what I love, this solar contagion effect, right? When you do it, when you see your neighbor do it, you can just see it spread because it's an intuitive idea. The other thing is, I think people should feel the freedom to talk to their utilities, right? Whether that's a municipal utility, whether that's a for-profit utility, whether that's a rural electric co-op, right? There's different governance structures here. But at the end of the day, right, we know the technology works, and our utilities need to be hearing from people that they want these solutions. And even if it's going to take us a while to work out a regulatory or policy fix, some type of enabling legislation, we need to begin building the groundswell of support. I will say that's something that made a huge difference in Alaska for community solar legislation. Our policymakers had been hearing for a decade from people who had been locked out of this solution that they wanted. Right. Mm-hmm. So it made a difference when we went to those policymakers. They said, this makes sense. We've heard from it. Let's do this. Let's get it done. So we need to plant those seeds so that we can have, gigawatts of solar bloom, or whatever the proper analogy is. I'm mixing up my metaphors.
I think Phil, that is so great, right? We individually, whether we can afford solar or not ourselves, speaking to it with our neighbors, with our friends, to our policymakers is important. So groups like Solar United Neighbors, right, and the way that they organize solar owners to then push for better policies and help bring solar to more people. The way Solar Rights Alliance here has stood up against the pretty egregious rate decisions and punitive measures against solar owners, right? Now we're building collective action. Now we're getting people together to talk about these things. And we want to enable that. We working with Pueblo, Colorado, the community had a whole host of needs that everybody was concerned with. Economic development, transition from coal, pollution. Now Pueblo, and we have a great video on this on our website, but Pueblo is building this community-wide set of solar developments. They're electrifying some of the town industries. They've got utility sponsored. Their utility is helping them sponsor battery storage. This is all because people are speaking up about it, right? That's a fundamental core thing. Speak up about it. The other thing, though, is I think you said it. We're seeing smaller entities, whether it's municipalities, municipal utilities, rural co-ops. Here in California, we have community choice aggregators, which are kind of sub-utilities to the larger utilities, right? They're offering these really innovative programs. People need to seek those out, see if they work, and actually use them. Oftentimes, there's just a crisis of dis or miss or lack of information here. And so going out, doing the research, I think that's a big step for anybody that's interested in pushing this forward, because the programs are there. Cora,
Cora froze a little bit there.
I think Cora's frozen.
All right. So yeah, I think she'll join back in a moment. All right, there's Cora.
Hi, sorry, my computer just crashed, but at a perfect time. So I just want to say thank you to everyone. This is a fantastic conversation. Phil, you need to come to Berkeley and visit Sach and I and have coffee, and we can continue this. But I'll turn over to Raj. I see a lot of questions coming in, and Raj is going to take us through a few of those.
Yeah, thanks, Cora. Appreciate it. Yeah, there are a number of questions here in the chat, and I really appreciate, by the way, the audience, everyone kind of answering each other's questions in the process too. So it's making my job easier. But one of the questions that had come up here was from Kobe Phillips, who had said, organizations in the middle of developing multifamily complex that operate as an island, mostly due to slow process of developing an interconnection agreement with our utility provider. Can you elucidate on the value in working with these utilities in changing from the perspective of the consumer or the developer? So I think it's more about how the utilities, the role the utilities play, and how we can potentially best engage with them given their position as much as from a business perspective, right, as anything else.
Sure. Well, listen, I don't want to defend the slow walking that utilities are basically presenting us with, right? The the intransigence, the delays, the lack of information. But I do need us to understand that they have, for the last 150 years, basically been run by engineers whose job it is to keep you safe and keep the lights on. That is their primary directive. So sometimes these interconnection delays, right, they're not coming from a place necessarily of wanting to prevent you from making a choice. Sometimes there are business motivations for them to not want that. But fundamentally, there are real queuing concerns, there's interconnection concerns, there's voltage concerns, there's lots of concerns that engineers are going to have about interconnection. What we need to do is put pressure on the utilities to think about a modern grid, to provide us with information about hosting capacity, and then for them to put their heads around, well, okay, if we have this hosting capacity, then let's go, bring the solar in, bring it in, right? Get them to see this as an opportunity for them so that they can make the interconnection of a multifamily islandable asset easy. And it should be, right? That should be an asset to those engineers. So some of it is you need folks like Cora and me and Phil to be out there as experts telling the regulators, yes, this is okay, bringing engineers into that, but also pressure them to have more streamlined hosting capacity. That's the ability for the grid to interconnect those assets, have those studies out there. And we're doing that. We're doing that in places like Michigan with Consumers Energy, right? So you've got a community justice resiliency plan that's going to sort of outline ways that we can interconnect more resources. In Minnesota, the same thing. We saw in Detroit Edison's territory, we identified areas, including dense urban areas with multifamily buildings, that were getting poorer service, that we could show were getting poorer service. And we showed how the interconnection of more solar resources would help alleviate that, highlight that to decision makers. Now the utility's on the hook. They're going to find ways to connect those buildings, that multifamily islandable array, because they are now under pressure to provide more equitable service in front of the important decision makers, right? That kind of motivation really works.
Absolutely. If I can just add in a couple more things here, Such, I think you're absolutely right. Talk to the utility. Not all utilities are governed the same, right? We talked about municipal utilities, rural electric co-ops, right? Some of these folks are interested in values beyond dollar signs, right? Obviously, all utilities are interested in making sure the system is safe and reliable. But also, don't be afraid to engage. And I know this is typically the domain of experts, but I would encourage the average citizen to do this. Go to your public utility commission. Right? The way that we have structured these utilities is we have given them a monopoly, but in exchange for that, they are publicly regulated, right? They should be accountable, as Sacha has talked about, right? So don't be afraid to engage with your public utility commission and say, help, right? We want these values. We're struggling to do this. And then finally, don't be afraid to engage policymakers, right? Because at the end of the day, the utility, the kind of social contract that we have around utilities is a social construct, right? And our regulators can change that. And of course, that's what Utah did with the enabling legislation.
Yeah. Social license is super important. I think that.
Any other questions, Raj, that you think are meaty that we should dig into?
I think it's as much of a comment and a question from someone saying that just was the here. So Bill McKibben started saying it's not alternative energy now, it's simply energy. It's no longer the Whole Foods of energy, but the Costco, because solar is now the cheapest form of energy on the planet. So the question was as much about the branding of that and otherwise the positioning of that as a reflection of where we are with solar costs today.
Phil said it earlier, right? I mean, the dominant source of new energy on our grid is solar, and it's technologies like batteries and wind, and it is now no longer just an upstart technology. It is a part of the firmament, and it is unlikely to be unseated from that position anytime soon. What we will see is our delays. What we will see are incumbent energy providers manipulating the market through their market power. What we need to see for example, at the large scale, at the bulk power level, is more open source RFPs. Let them compete on the market. There is some truth to the market working here. So don't put up artificial barriers. And for folks in the behind the meter and the local solar space, which is where we can get a lot of speed and scale right now, the Utah legislation is a great example. Colorado has solar gardens. Minnesota also has solar gardens. You have states that are streamlining the permitting process. We've got to take the transactional barriers out of it as much as possible, provide the value, and then you have many choices for how to fuel your lives, and you will pick the one that is most cost efficient, that is cleanest, that is best for your kids, for your family, and that's often going to be solar plus batteries. And I think Bill McKibben is exactly right on that.
Absolutely. And if, the one thing that I can add to this, there is often skepticism, especially in a place like Alaska, about, wait, how is solar working here, right? And of course, the reality is we actually get as much solar radiation here as Phoenix does, right? We just get it in a more concentrated part of the year. Right. We get it. We basically don't get a lot of sun in the middle of the winter, but we have the midnight sun in the summer. Right. I saw the sunrise the other morning at 3 a.m. Right. And so one of the things that I think is helpful to think about is, I love solar more than anything else. When we think about the grid, though, this is a team sport. Right? This is about solar. This is about storage. This is about wind. This is about other energy technologies. And I really think that we need to think about hybridity, right? Solar will make a tremendous difference for Alaska grid, for Alaska's ratepayers, but it's going to have an outsized influence some months rather than others, right? And those kind of nuances. But I think Bill McKibben, his framing is absolutely right. The data backs it up. And let's not forget, despite any setbacks we've had in the United States, the rest of the world is moving forward with this faster than ever. The EU, China, right? We can look at what's happened in Pakistan. The engineers have done their jobs. Learning curves are doing their jobs, right? The more we deploy, the cheaper it gets globally. That is one of the most brilliant and beautiful things in human history.
Yeah, those learning curves are incredible. The way we've driven costs down over the last decade and a half is just going to be repeated for batteries. It's going to be repeated for so many of these technologies. The 120 volts water heaters, that's huge. I have a 240 volt water heater, and it takes up a ton of room and half the space on my utility box, but that's not going to change. And actually that brings up something that I think is really important to add in here. And it's the idea of a negawatt, of demand response, of energy efficiency, right? Energy is certainly what we use, but it's also what we don't use, right? How can we use the least amount of energy to get the services that we need? That's really important. And that points to the need for a flexible grid where we don't just have demand that everybody needs their lights on at a certain time and their stove and their air conditioning running. We can actually move the demand around. We can have energy, and we can move that energy around, and we can meet the two in the most cost-effective way possible. And people that adopt solar, whether it's balcony or rooftop, or they're part of a community solar program, they just add that much more time to thinking about energy. Maybe they shut the lights off a little bit more. Maybe they're more conscientious about when they do laundry, when they wash the dishes, to a certain extent. I mean, there's only so much we can do. But now we're taking everything into account: how we use it, where we get it from, how it's delivered to us. All of those things work together to get to the most affordable, most efficient, cleanest, most reliable system that we can build. That flexibility is going to be the hallmark of the grid going forward if we're successful.
Mm.
And I'll just throw on to the end of that too. Sorry, is that and add into all of that is storage, right? So I think if once you're able to flatten those curves or otherwise, it's a fantastic element to all of it too. So and on the plug-in side of it too. So just on throw that.
Yeah.
This was such a fun conversation. I love that we're all dreamers, we're all visionaries, but we all aren't afraid of sweat and tears to get it done on the ground. So I just want to say thank you to everyone. I think we're at time. Is that right, Raj?
That is, so we are.
Yeah, we're at time. Thank you, everyone. There are questions we did not get to. We will be sending out a follow-up email to everyone who's here, including the recording and also some responses to the questions we didn't get to. So I just want to thank everyone for believing in this. And, you know, whenever we talk about this, I feel hopeful. My eyes light up. So thank you to our guests, to Raj, to everyone on this webinar. It's been a pleasure.
Cora, it's always great to have your optimism. So coffee with you is a bright spot in the day, and I appreciate it.
Nice pun.
Thank you guys so much. Great conversation.
Everyone. Take
Thanks,
care.
everybody. See you.